It's been about a year since my last video game review, and man, have I been craving to review something for a while now. I figured, you know what, I want to look at another obscure first-person shooter, which brings us to a game called Shellshock 2, Blood Trails for the PS3, Xbox 360, and the PC. It was released back in February of 2009 by the publisher Eidos Interactive. Developed by Rebellion. Right away that sets off a huge red flag for me. Rebellion was the developer behind the massive failure that is Rouge Warrior and a number of not so great titles like Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, Miami Vice, and Midnight Club Street Racing, all of which were on portable systems. However, Rebellion has made some decent or even good games like The Simpsons game, Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron, and Rogue Trooper, for example. Rebellion seems to be more of a hit or miss type studio, more so than maybe any of the other average studios out there. What does that mean for Shellshock 2 Blood Trails? Well, let's take a look and find out. The game is set in Vietnam, where you play as Nate Walker. Long story short, your brother gets infected with some sort of mysterious contagion. It basically turns people into zombies, but instead of them being slow and menacing, these zombies are fast and otherwise ruthless. The story revolves around you tracking down your brother's footsteps, trying to figure out who or what this white knight thing is and where it came from. Along the way, you find out that the Vietnamese army is also after your brother and White Knight as well. The story does sound, mildly interesting. However, the way they tell it is pretty lackluster, and truthfully, it became boring relatively quickly, so much so that I couldn't really tell you much else that happens in the game. It doesn't help that they introduce useless characters like this big titty monster who then dies within 6 minutes into the same level you first meet her? Then for God knows what fucking reason, she shows up for some hallucinations 2 or 3 levels after, and then never again. Why? I don't understand. Who could possibly give a shit about this character or what she's saying? This was the turning point in the game where I lost all hope for the story and stopped caring about it entirely. Then that brings us to the ending of the game, where you are given a choice that, of course, affects the outcome. The only reason I even remember this is because of how poorly executed it was. The writing, acting, everything about how they put the ending and really the entire story together was really bad.
I'm dreaming, right?
Even dreams don't get this good, baby. I'm all real. You want to touch?
Is that a trick question?
Serena! What have I told you? This isn't a game. I, Rupert Zidek, forbid you to use that gun.
Well, anyway, let's talk about the visuals of Shellshock 2 for a moment. So, at first glance, the graphics don't appear too bad. Yeah, they're dated, but whatever. That shouldn't be too much of a big reason to complain, considering the obvious fact that Shellshock is a budget title. However, the more I delved into the game, the more I hated the visuals. Getting the simple stuff out of the way, obviously the textures are muddy and the character design leaves a lot to be desired. However, one of the biggest issues I had was the lighting. Nearly every single level is inexplicably dark, for no reason. Even some of the levels that took place in broad daylight are still dark to me. Now fine, Shellshock 2 is a horror game by some degree. That's fine. That's okay. The problem with terrible lighting, especially overly dark lighting, is that the enemy, at least in this game, can shoot you from any distance and hit you with really no trouble. Whereas I couldn't see where the hell I was being shot from unless they got within 50 feet from me. Now, as far as the enemies who are melee only, like the zombies or whatever these machete-wielding dudes are called, that's not a big deal whatsoever, and the darker lighting works for those enemies. But when the Viet Cong are around, the dark lighting is a massive hindrance and negatively affects the combat, considering half the time you don't have a goddamn clue where the enemy is shooting you from. Sometimes it even seems like they're shooting you halfway across the field, even when you're behind cover. Another problem with the graphics, at least with this PlayStation 3 copy, is that holy sweet baby rays does it have a lot of screen tearing and frame rate issues. The screen tearing normally doesn't really bother me too much in games, but it's such a common occurrence that you can't help but notice it. These two problems are even exposed in cutscenes and QuickTime events. It's so obvious. And speaking of cutscenes, can we just take a moment to talk about how hilarious they are? The best is the one right at the beginning when the Viet Cong walk into a room where you and your sergeant are, and the guy is standing there like a deer caught in the headlights and gunned down to a side. Then after like 2-3 seconds, your sergeant shoots him. The whole thing is like straight out of a bad 80s B movie. Or another fun moment is when a cutscene happens where characters are placed in a totally different location before and after the cutscene finishes.
Freeze. Make it like a fucking statue. What the fuck is that?
Now let's talk about the gameplay. First thing I want to point out again is that this game is technically marketed as a first-person shooter / horror game. The game fails in just about every single way to be scary. In fact, I don't think it ever tries to go out of its way to be scary either. They do include, typical jump scares and loud, piercing sound effects to catch you off guard, but there's no substance to it. Not once in this game did I ever feel nervous, scared, hesitant, whatever. Whenever a frightening moment happens, and I use the term frightening very loosely, it doesn't affect me in the slightest. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. Yes, there was a point during the game that had a very badly timed jump scare, and I laughed my ass off. To be fair, they did include plenty of gore, with soldiers having heads and legs cut off and zombies ripping people apart, but when you've watched so many action and horror movies, let alone me having played a ton of horror games throughout my life, these otherwise disturbing images have no real effect because I've already seen it. The controls aren't too bad. I've definitely dealt with worse from both budget titles and even AAA titles, so that's kind of a plus. Aiming, looking around, and navigating is noticeably stiff and somewhat clunky, but it's not unbearable by any means. And oddly enough, this game has a adjustable aim assist, a feature that was not very common at the time, or even today for that matter. The gameplay, it's not fun whatsoever. It drags like crazy, honestly, and that's not because the levels are all that long. They really aren't. I completed the game in, about 3 hours maybe, so the average person might complete it anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, which is typical for the shooters of this era, I guess. The game drags because the combat and the gameplay itself is so monotonous. It's bland, boring, tedious. I mean, I could use a dozen of words to describe the gameplay, and none of which are any good. Yes, fine, there are a couple of levels that are somewhat enjoyable to some extent, none of which include any of the levels where you fight the Viet Cong. I say that because of what I said before with the awful lighting and the AI being unknowingly difficult. When you are fighting the Viet Cong, it plays like any other terrible generic first-person shooter from the PS3 and 360 era of consoles. Except you can't really see the enemy all that well. There are some zombie levels that are more enjoyable, but even then, it still doesn't rise above mediocrity. And while I'm on the subject, I have to point out that second to last level where there's a ton of zombies and the majority of that level, the only weapon you have is the worst fucking shotgun I have ever seen in any shooter I have ever played. It takes like 3 to 4 shots to take down one zombie unless you pull off a headshot. I probably died 5 or 6 times because I kept getting swarmed by zombies and couldn't do anything because of how bad that piece of shit gun is. I got so mad at one point I had to take a break and walk away, or else I would have quit entirely, or I would have just thrown up due to the extreme amount of camera shake when you get hit, run, shoot, really do anything. I normally don't get motion sickness while playing video games, but I definitely was in this case. There's not much more I can say about Shellshock 2 without beating a dead horse, and to be blunt, I don't want to talk about this game any longer than I absolutely have to. And you know, as I was writing my notes for this review, I kept questioning myself, like, is this a bad game? Is this a so bad it's funny game? Like, what is this? What do I call a game like Shellshock 2? But then it hit me. This is a I don't know why it exists game. Like, the concept isn't really innovative whatsoever. It's not breaking any grounds. The story is unmemorable and arguably frustrating. The gameplay is a mix of aggravating, annoying, and mediocre. It's just a total waste, really. Do I recommend Shellshock 2 Blood Trails? You know, in a weird way, I almost do. Only because this game should be documented in a sense to show developers how not to make an exciting, fun, enjoyable, great game. That's the thing too, because Shellshock is not even close to being one of the worst games I've ever played, but even those games that were way worse than Shellshock 2, I thought were more interesting. And it's funny, the more I played Shellshock 2, the more I began to violently hate it. Like, I want absolutely nothing to do with this garbage game ever again. That's gonna do it for today's review, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Give him a 20. 20 cc's. Nah, 20 bucks. Yeah, 20 fucking cc's.